I'm Grace Stranch. I'm the co-president of the Nashville Chapter of the American Constitution Society. Thank you so much for everyone joining us for this very important topic. I'm going to give you a few housekeeping and just let you know about ACS and heard about us before. We are the American Constitution Society, and we believe that the Constitution is of the people, by the people, and for the people. So we interpret the Constitution based on its text against the backdrop of history for a lived experience. And we are made up of progressive lawyers, judges, students, activists across the US working towards these ideals. We have CLE for this event. So if you're an attorney and you're looking for continuing legal education, I'm gonna put in the chat Callie Jennings, the other co-president's email. And after this is over, if you can send her an email with your full name and BPR number, we'll make sure to get you that. As well as if you have questions throughout the event or after the event, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A. If you could put the questions in the Q&A, we'll try to get to those as we can. If we're not able to get to them, let us know. We'll try to direct you to the individual afterwards. We'll ask all the panelists. And just to let you know, the call is being recorded, so you most likely will be able to watch it afterwards. But if you have any questions, you can hopefully go back there. But if there's something you don't want to ask that's being recorded, maybe save that question for afterwards. And you can also, I'm going to give you my email address as well. We have lots of opportunities to get involved with ACS. There's a ton of pro bono opportunities with Constitution in the classroom with students. There's Jim Crow juries where we're helping individuals get their voting rights back. And we just want to be a resource for the community, and you can come to us. So I'm going to let Shauna, who is one of the individuals who put this together, to go ahead and start the program. Shauna?
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. As she mentioned, I'm Shauna Huey. I'm an ACS board member and president of Think Tennessee. Think Tennessee is a nonpartisan, results-oriented think tank. We're focused on two things: empowering voters and increasing family economic security. More about that with some of our information in a second. But first I want to get to our panelists, because we have a really, really great, so many wonderful speakers today on this panel. So let me introduce each of them, and then we're going to get to the meat of our conversation, which is about expanding absentee voting in Tennessee, or not expanding absentee voting in Tennessee during the pandemic, and what that's going to look like. So first, our panelists. First, we've got Charlane Oliver, who is co-founder and co-executive director of the Equity Alliance. As many folks on this call already know, the Equity Alliance is a Nashville-based grassroots nonprofit focused on voting rights advocacy and increasing civic engagement in communities of color. Before Charlane ran the Equity Alliance, or sort of concurrently with, at the beginning she was community liaison and communications strategist for Congressman Jim Cooper. Fun fact about Charlane, she led the development of Project Register, which I think is maybe their first of its kind in the nation. It was a nonpartisan initiative that helped more than 200 businesses in Middle Tennessee get their employees registered to vote. Next, we've got Tom Gustelli, who's the legal director of the ACLU of Tennessee. As part of his work, Tom leads the high impact civil rights litigation in both state and federal courts. Before Tom came to the ACLU, he was an attorney in private practice. And Tom says that one of his fun facts is that he started out as a big firm lawyer who was on track for a career in bankruptcy law. So quite a shift for Tom. Tricia Herzfeld is a partner at Branstetter, Stranch, and Jennings. She also serves as a member of the Davidson County Election Commission, so she's been a little bit busy these days. Fun fact, Tricia used to be the legal director for the ACLU of Tennessee. So I don't know if you and Tom actually shared a desk. If Tom is sitting at your actual desk, Tricia, or how that worked, but keeping it all in the family. And then we've got Ezra Rosenberg, who's co-director of the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in DC. As part of that work, Ezra oversees all voting rights litigation for LCCR. This role is a continuation of a 40-year career, very distinguished in both public and private practice, as part of which Ezra has earned designation as one of the best litigators in the nation. Ezra was lead counsel in a case challenging Texas's voter ID law. And we were talking before the call about how, I know we've all had so many Zoom calls, but here's the perk. It's not every day that we get to have Ezra join us at an ACS Nashville event. So the upside of all of these Zoom calls is being able to bring in great speakers from all over the country. So thank you to all of you amazing panelists for being with us. I'm going to turn over to a conversation with all of you in just a moment. And then again, as Grace mentioned, to your questions for folks who are participating today, just a reminder, pop those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So to inform your questions and our conversation, I wanted to make sure that we are all operating with a common set of facts about what is happening around absentee voting. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to talk about what is what with absentee voting. So you should be able to see a bunch of graphics right now about absentee voting. They're put together by Think Tennessee, which again is a nonpartisan statewide think tank. So here are just a few highlights about absentee voting in our state this year. So Tennessee this year is one of just a handful of states that will require most voters to appear in person to cast a ballot. As you can see on this map with the yellow states, 2/3 of states already allow every voter to vote absentee in every election whenever they want. They don't need an excuse. There's 16, that leaves 16 states that don't do that. And of those 16, all but 4 have taken action to allow folks to vote absentee during the pandemic. Now, I should note that most of these states are focused on their primaries, some of which we know are happening today. I'm sure we're all watching that Kentucky one closely. But you see Tennessee in a very small group of states that has not expanded absentee to all voters this year. And as you may have noticed, our state legislature recessed last week, and they did so after voting down proposals by both Democrats and Republicans to expand absentee during the pandemic. So they're not going to have, our General Assembly is not going to have another chance to act before the presidential election. That was it. So one reason that we sometimes hear for why our state hasn't expanded absentee voting is we just don't have the money to do it. And so again, to ground us all in a common set of facts, I think it's important that we understand that up to $55 million in federal funding is available in Tennessee to make new investments in our elections. Some of that in that sort of the gray portion of the pie on the lower right, you'll see that some of it actually has to be spent on pandemic-related increases in election spending. So we've got a bucket that's got about $55 million in it. And Think Tennessee did some analysis to figure out how much it would cost to expand absentee voting for November, and we came up with about $19.2 million. So in a bucket that contains $55 million, about 19.2 it would cost. So, you know, only a portion of what we would have, or only a portion of the money that we could spend, which of course also has to be spent on other ways to secure and modernize our elections. But the money is there if that's how we chose to spend it. Now, in a normal year, most Tennesseans don't vote absentee, and that's something that I hear a lot. Our absentee vote out typically hovers about 2%, but nobody thinks that this is a normal year. And we've got some examples of sort of absentee voting from Wisconsin. Probably all remember their primary a couple months ago. They usually get about 200,000 absentee voters, and they had more than 1 million requests in their recent primary. We know that voters from across the spectrum want to see absentee ballot options this year. There's been a national poll, which we cite to in the brief there. A couple of recent state polls in Tennessee showed the same thing, one by the Tennessean and one by Secure Democracy. Both showed majority support among Tennessee voters for options this year, whether you want to be able to choose for you, whether it's best for you and your family to go vote in person or to vote absentee. So we see that that's really what voters want. And I know at Think Tennessee, we believe that temporarily expanding absentee voting is an important part of the solution. But with the legislature out of the session and with the governor unlikely to take action on his own, even though he would have the power to issue an executive order, we don't see that happening anytime soon based on some comments that he's made recently. So now all eyes turn to the courts, and that is exactly where our panelists come in. And so I am going to unshare my screen as soon as I can figure out how to do that. Give me 1 second, sorry guys. Grace, is there anything that you can do to unshare my screen? Hold on, sorry. Hold on, I'm gonna go, Grace, you're muted.
I'm working on that right now. I'm gonna stop I think I can stop everyone.
Yeah, I just got my video. Here,
there we go. That should, okay.
Okay.
Let me see if this works.
It's working really hard. There we go. Okay, we're back. Okay, so with that comedic interlude, I'm going to kick off the conversation with each of our panelists. Again, panelists, I'm going to direct some initial questions to you all, to one specific speaker, but please feel free to weigh in as, you know, if you've got some thoughts and you're another panelist as well. Okay, so Charlene, I'm going to start with a question for you. You know, we've been talking about how Tennessee is one of just 4 states that so far has failed to expand absentee voting. Can you talk to us a little bit about why it matters? You know, what's the impact on Tennessee voters, particularly those who are from communities of color or who are low income? Oh, and hey, you're muted, Charlene.
There we go.
There you go.
All right, thank you, Shauna, for having me on. Yeah, you know, the Equity Alliance, we are all about, you know, expanding access to the voting booth for Black and Brown Tennesseans, making sure that for centuries, those barriers that have been put in our way get removed by way of all of the voter suppression tactics that, you know, plague our communities, that disproportionately plague Black communities. And, you know, this coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated sort of the problems that we are already experiencing in our electoral process. Now we have to worry about the pandemic being an added layer of barriers that we have to work through. So when we talk about Tennessee being only one of 4 states that is not wanting to expand absentee ballots, I'm not surprised because we are also consistently ranking the bottom 5 states for voter participation. So there's a correlation there of a state that does not want us to vote by way of, by design, because of the barriers that they put in place. So it's no different that they would not want to expand absentee ballots. And by they, I mean our conservative state legislature. The impact that this is going to have on communities of color is going to be drastic. We are working with a set of barriers that really, I shouldn't say only impacts our community. First of all, you have the digital divide that we now have to work through. We're doing this panel on Zoom, but not everyone has access to the internet or has access to a printer to print off an absentee ballot. So when we talk about the elderly population that may be technologically challenged, or low income, low propensity voters that don't know how to navigate the internet process to get an absentee ballot. That's a challenge in and of itself that we have to educate people around. And then you have people in our community who have underlying health conditions that, you know, Black folks are getting the coronavirus more than any other demographic. Also the Hispanic population, now we're seeing a rise in cases. So, you know, we don't want to go out and vote and put ourselves at risk. So we are also having to battle with this duality of, do I be concerned more about our health or more about my right to vote? And we shouldn't be having to make that choice. So expanding absentee ballots to everyone should be the way to go. The other thing that is unique to our community is this distrust of government. Black folks don't trust the government. Let's just keep it real. And we have every reason not to, because of the government tends to not want to work for us. So I am hearing a lot of folks who are not trusting the mail delivery process, and will my vote actually be counted? So we're having to, as the Equity Alliance, battle some of this misinformation that people are dealing with, some of these fears. And then you also have a language barrier. Will our absentee ballot applications be printed in multiple languages to help the immigrant communities and Hispanic communities who are sort of Spanish speaking is their native tongue. So those are some of the barriers that we're working through.
Thanks so much, Charlene, for grounding us in sort of the why of why we're all doing this work. So, you know, that certainly underscored the need for a change in our state. And now with the General Assembly having failed to act, all eyes turn to the courts. So Tom, this one is for you. Chancellor Lyle of the Davidson County Chancery Court has made a couple of significant rulings over the past month in a case brought by the ACLU and some other plaintiffs. And I'm hoping that you can tell us more.
Yeah, sure. We brought it. There's actually 2 lawsuits that were filed in state court with various different plaintiffs. And I think what's important about who brought it is that there are, as Charlene mentioned, people with underlying conditions that make it very risky for them to leave their home, much less go stand in line to vote. But also just people who don't have those that just feel like they don't want to take that risk. So, you know, the plaintiffs were kind of representative of everyone in the state that desires this ability to vote by mail. But there was a hearing, and Chancellor Lyle entered I think, very thoughtful, narrowly drawn decision saying that vote by mail should be extended to everyone in the state of Tennessee during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think if you read the decision, she was really very careful in how she made this decision. She was, I think, you know, was sympathetic towards the fact that the state is, you know, hurting economically right now, but found that there is, as some of the information, Shana, that you showed earlier about, there's this pot of money. They had already printed a lot of ballots in anticipation of there being an uptick in absentee voting for people who are already eligible that have an excuse. Specifically, I think the largest class of those being people who are over the age of 60. And then she discounted and went through the evidence that was put on about some of the allegations about voter fraud, and said that there wasn't enough evidence of that. So it was a very, I think, you know, a well thought out, you know, conservative order, just saying, you're not going to make everybody vote by mail. We're not going to make the state hand out ballots to every single person, send out ballots to every single person in the state. But if anybody wants to request one, they get one. And then the second order, there are a couple more orders that she issued. One was to ensure that the forms were clear so that people knew that they could request this. And then she denied a stay. So we've now I think that the initial ruling came down on June 4th. So we're on the 19th day of people being able to request these ballots, and people are doing that. So, you know, so more and more people are being able to take advantage of this. Just to kind of, I guess, a litigation update. I mean, this has been appealed. We're kind of in the middle of the appellate process, and but so far the appellate courts haven't stayed Judge Lyle or Chancellor Lyle's order. So this continues to be, her order continues to be in effect. This ability to request an absentee ballot is persisting, and until some court tells us that they can't, or ultimately the request by the state to stay Judge Lyle's decision is denied.
Thanks, Tom. And I've got some follow-up questions about, what happens to the class of folks who have requested ballots, but we'll get to those in just a second. And ultimately it's overturned. But wanted to talk about this from the angle of a local election official for a second. So Tricia, this one's for you, because we're talking about a situation that is sort of very much up in the air right now, and yet we've got to get ready for the August primaries. And I will say Davidson County's election commission has been sort of a model for the state in the right way to do this. Can you talk to us about what local election commissions are doing to prepare, and what your role is in absentee voting? Could you, for instance, just decide, like in Davidson County, we would like to let all voters vote absentee? And I guess the last part of that question, Tricia, is, what are you doing if Chancellor Lyle's order is in effect right now, which it is? What does that mean for the Davidson County Election Commission? What is staff over there, and what are the election officials over there doing right now to prepare?
Thank you, Shauna, and thanks everybody for having me today. So the Davidson County Election Commission has actually been on top of the absentee ballot issue for a long time. If you'll recall, our last election date was about 4 hours after a tornado had touched down in Davidson County. And so the commission has been working really hard to make sure that as many people can vote, and to take down any potential barriers for a while, but specifically since we started with the tornado voting. And we knew that we were going to have a lot more people voting absentee after that point. Especially then you've got COVID, right? You add COVID to the mix. So we've had a plan going for months and months. You know, just as COVID was still a rumor, we were still talking about trying to push as many people to absentee voting as we could, specifically trying to get out the information of, you know, the various categories of folks that could vote absentee. Since the lawsuits, clearly, everyone now can vote absentee. I will tell you, I know there was a little bit of back and forth as to whether the state was having folks send out absentee ballots or not when they were requested for purposes of COVID. And since the order has come down, the Davidson County Election Commission has not stopped. We've never once not sent out an absentee ballot since the order came down from Judge Lyle. To give you kind of an example of what we're looking at absentee ballot wise, in similar election in August of 2016, we had 1,736 absentee ballots requested and 1,070 absentee ballots returned. So similar election, August 2016. As of today's date, I got these numbers this morning. The Davidson County Election Commission has received 12,700 requests for absentee ballot, and we have received 4,277 absentee ballots back. So knowing that we were going to be shifting a lot of our voters of the electorate to non-voting day, right? I mean, that's what we're really trying to avoid, is having as many people, you know, present in one place on election day. We've really tried to push as many people to absentee voting and put that information out there, as well as getting folks to really spend some time thinking about our expanded early vote options, which include all sites that are now open for the 2 full weeks ahead of election day. So what we did is, you know, we're not going to need quite as many poll workers on election day, you would assume, because you won't have as many people in each election polling station. So we've taken a lot of those folks and moved them over to helping us process the absentee ballot. So as of right now, if you submit your absentee ballot application to the Davidson County Election Commission, we're running on about an average of 24 hours to get that ballot out to you. So we're moving pretty quickly. But to follow up on, I think, probably some of the other questions that you asked, there definitely, and maybe some of Charlane's points, you know, there definitely are some difficulties in it. You know, we've made it so the form at the Davidson County Election Commission, you can fill it out, so you can type in your name and those things online, but you still have to have a printer and you still have to print it out and actually physically sign it. You can't do an electronic signature, and that's by state law. One of the other difficulties that I personally have run into is I have a daughter who's out of state in college, as some of you know, and so she votes absentee, and she has been, you know, since she's been eligible. But a lot of college age students, a lot of college age people don't own a stamp. And our return, you know, to return the absentee ballot, it's not postage prepaid, right? You've got to put a stamp on it in order to send it back. I cannot tell you the angst that this caused, you know, my daughter and all of her friends, that they were like, we don't own a stamp. We do everything online. How do I go get a stamp? I have to go physically put it in the mail. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but you are finding that a lot of younger folks, you know, aren't thinking about things like having that stamp. Now, what we do know is the post office will actually deliver your absentee ballot, even if it's got insufficient postage. So it's not something you really want to advertise. It's kind of the fail-safe, but they will deliver it to the Election Commission in any event.
That's good to know, Tricia. Quick follow-up on that, though. Am I right that state law also says that if you're a first-time voter, so thinking about maybe a lot of your daughter's peers who don't have a mom on the Election Commission, who maybe weren't paying attention to some of the very first elections that they were able to vote in, now they're going to vote for the first time absentee from their college campus. Can they do that in Tennessee?
So that's really a complicated question that I think we're still waiting for the courts to, for the courts to sort out. You've got my position on the Davidson County Election Commission, which I think, the answer is, I think everybody hasn't gotten official guidance from the state on that yet. But from my position as a civil rights lawyer, I would say, of course, Chancellor Lyle's opinion should cover, first-time voters. And for those of you who don't know, right, your first time voting, you have to vote in person. So you either have to have registered to vote in person at the Election Commission, or you have to vote in person for your first time before you're allowed to do absentee, which creates a huge problem for a lot of our students who registered through voter registration drives or, online or, however else they've done it. And now they need to be voting absentee because of COVID. So I think that that's an issue that still needs to get worked out.
Thanks, Tricia. So we've been talking about Chancellor Lyle's decision, and that's of course all moving through the state courts. There's a separate track with the Equity Alliance is the plaintiff, LCCR is a plaintiff in federal court. So with these folks as plaintiffs, and Ezra, this question's for you, additional legislation, I wish it were legislation, litigation is making its way through the federal courts right now. Ezra, can you tell us a little bit about the federal case and what impact that might have?
Sure, Shauna. And first of all, thanks very much for inviting us to participate on this panel, and in particular to invite me to participate in a panel with people who are fighting so hard to make sure that everyone in Tennessee does not have to choose between exercising their right to vote and worrying about their health. And I'm thrilled to be on a panel with Charlane, and the Equity Alliance has really given us the honor of representing them, not only in this pending case that we're going to talk about, but in a case last year where we were able to strike down some draconian statutory provisions that would impose civil and criminal penalties on organizations that were just helping people register to vote. And thanks, Charlane, for giving us that opportunity. The federal case that we and Campaign Legal Center have filed on behalf of the Equity Alliance and A. Philip Randolph Institute and some other organizations, Tennessee NAACP and the AFL-CIO, it raises the claim that Tom has won. He won it on state grounds. We've raised it on federal constitutional grounds. The great thing about being able to go two tracks is, as Tom pointed out, just gives you an appeal. It's an extraordinarily strong appeal. Stand up.
Hey, Ezra, your audio, I think, at least for me, got messed up there for a second. Would you mind just repeating the last couple of sentences?
Well, I was talking about Tom because Tom is wrong. So
you sort of Ezra. You were perfect at the beginning.
I don't know what to do.
Oh, you're back. You're totally back. There,
okay.
We're good now. If you could repeat the last couple of sentences.
Sure. I was talking about the case that Tom won, and Tom and the ACLU won in state court, which he won on state constitutional grounds. And it's an extraordinarily strong opinion by Judge Lyle. She did a great job. I think it should stand up on appeal. On the off chance it doesn't, there is now a federal backup. And the federal backup is the case that we and Campaign Legal Center have brought based on federal constitutional grounds, that the right to vote is impinged by not allowing no excuse absentee ballot voting. But we've also brought three other claims, and we are now pressing those claims by way of a motion for preliminary injunction. We're not pressing the claim that Tom won, unless something happens and the off chance that's reversed, in which case we will then move for preliminary injunction on that claim. The first claim that we're pressing otherwise is the claim that Tricia just mentioned, which has to do with the first-time voters who have registered by mail. The first time they vote, they must vote in person. And we're saying in the context of COVID, that is a violation of their right to vote. So that's the first claim we're pressing, which is a COVID related claim. We're also pressing two claims relating to absentee ballots that are not limited to COVID. The first is the failure of the state of Tennessee to provide a cure process when an absentee ballot is rejected on the basis of signature mismatch. And by that I mean, when someone submits their absentee ballot, they have to sign it. and the election officials are supposed to compare their signatures to the signature on record. And if they don't feel the signature matches, they reject it. It is an extraordinarily, it's a process that's susceptible to abuse, and there are no standards. But on top of that, the voter does not know that his or her vote has been rejected until after the election, and has no opportunity to cure it. So the vote has not been counted, and no way to make it better. We say that's unconstitutional. It's a violation of procedural due process. It's a violation of the federal right to vote. The last claim that we're pressing is against a statute in Tennessee that makes it a misdemeanor for anyone to distribute a request for an absentee ballot unless it's solicited, an unsolicited request for an absentee ballot. That's ridiculous. Particularly now when organizations are striving to help people figure out how to maneuver through the absentee ballot procedure. For them to be subject to up to just a shade under a year in prison, because it's a misdemeanor, for simply distributing a request for an absentee ballot makes absolutely no sense. We say that violates the First Amendment and the due process, and that's the other claim that we're pressing. So those claims are in addition to the claim that Thomas won. He won on a state ground. We're waiting in the wings to see if we have to press it on federal grounds.
So thinking about that, Ezra, what is the timeline? I mean, is it sort of sequential? We're going to wait and see what happens in the state appellate process, or are they moving on kind of parallel tracks, all happening at the same time?
Well, we're moving on a fast track in terms of those three claims, other than the claim that Tom won. And those, we filed a motion for a preliminary injunction, I think about 2 weeks ago. So that's going to be argued sometime in the summer, and hopefully in time for the August election, if not, definitely in time for November. The other claim, we're holding back. It's filed, it's there. If I know that the state of Tennessee has gone on a fast track to try to reverse the ACLU's victory. If, again, I don't think it should happen, and I don't think it will happen, but if it does happen, we will immediately file a motion for preliminary injunction on federal grounds to get Tennessee eligibility requirements to be no excuse.
Thanks, Ezra. We've got questions coming in. A reminder for folks who are watching, if you've got questions, please go ahead and pop them into the Q&A box, and we'll turn to those in just a minute. I wanted to follow up, Tricia, on something that I sort of alluded to a little while ago, which is now, the Davidson County Election Commission, and presumably most or all of the 94 other election commissions in the state, are now sending out and receiving back completed absentee ballots that have been completed by voters like me, right? So I wouldn't normally qualify for an absentee ballot, but this time, based on Chancellor Lyle's ruling, I do. What happens? Let's say, the ACLU's victory gets overturned in appellate court. What happens? Do we have any idea to the class of voters that has completed, as allowed at the time, a ballot, but then that privilege sort of gets taken away, or that right gets taken away?
So there's actually kind of two classes of voters I think that you're talking about. There's the one that was from Chancellor Lyle's initial decision to the second decision a week later. And at that point, the state election commission, or the administrator of elections for the state, had done a separate COVID category on the absentee ballot request form. And so hypothetically, those could be segregated for, special or different treatment if for some reason the order of Chancellor Lyle were to be overturned. I personally think there would be a whole lot of problems doing that for a whole variety of reasons, but I won't give all my legal opinions at this point. Secondarily, however, once Chancellor Lyle put down her second order, she clarified exactly what category COVID should go in on the absentee request form. So she made it as I am, ill, hospitalized, or, fear of getting COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all in one. So I think it'd be quite difficult to be able to parse out who's a quote COVID voter versus a, I'm otherwise ill or hospitalized voter. And, I think that was probably intentional, because there isn't a separate section for COVID in the code. It's clearly something we've all interpreted as being ill, or, a caretaker for someone who's ill, something in that category. So I think it was the appropriate choice that she made to specifically make that language within an existing category. But now they're all being processed with that category being much broader. So I think it'd be really difficult, if not impossible, to kind of look behind that to figure out who was COVID versus who would be ill under non-COVID circumstances. Davidson County is not segregating them in any way. We've been pushing them out. Minute it comes in, push it out. There's way too many coming in and way too many we have to keep on top of. We just don't want to get behind. We don't want to end up in a situation where we're behind. And so, you know, we've been very liberal in how it is that, you know, we've accepted COVID voters, you know, from the beginning. If people say they're ill, they're ill. And, you know, it's not my choice or someone else's choice to go and ask someone, why are you ill? You know, what is it that's wrong with you? So Chancellor Lyle's opinion was quite helpful. And, you know, the other point I'd like to make is the federal case that Ezra has is challenging so many other provisions of the law that I think is really, really, really important. You know, as election commissioners, we're strong, you know, hamstrung, you know, at some level about what it is we can do and what it is we can't do. You know, if the Davidson County Election Commission could have voted, I think we would have said, sure, let's open it up to everybody, you know, just on our own. But unfortunately, we're stuck by state law and what it is that what the state directs us to do to some extent.
Thanks, Tricia. And I think this is another question for you, or maybe some of the lawyers on the call too. So I guess, you know what, it could really be for anybody. One of the things that voters sometimes have a reticence, and this is, I'm taking one of the questions from the Q&A box, are sometimes reticent to vote by absentee because there's this myth or fact that absentee ballots don't get counted right away. And, you know, maybe they only get counted if the election's close, or, and I think sometimes that also persists with when folks vote provisionally and then go back and cure their provisional ballot. So do we know, you know, when absentee ballots will be counted for the upcoming August primary or the November general? Is it sort of that same day, just like any other vote, or is it going to be sometime in the future?
So it's generally when we set the absentee ballot counting board to meet. So, you know, it's a date that has not yet been determined. We're going to have a whole lot more than we did last time. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're doing it, you know, over the course of the entire day. We're supposed to have an election commission meeting on Friday. So I'm guessing we'll talk about exactly what that's going to look like at that point. But folks should know that just what you see for, you know, election results that come in on election night, right? We all look and refresh and refresh and refresh on the website to see exactly how those have come out. Those are never the final tallies. And so sometimes I think folks, you know, start to think that that's final. So, okay, I don't have to go back in for my provisional ballot or whatever it is. That's not the case. We typically have a meeting about a week, generally about a week, give or take, after the election date, where we sit down and we go through any other things that have come in. So we actually we now get a huge spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet goes through and breaks down exactly how many absentee ballots we had, how many provisional ballots we had, how many people were rejected, what the reason for rejection was, if people came in and cured. So we can take a really good look at that to see if we have any systemic problems or any problems with people's voting, you know, counting so far as we know. So everybody's vote counts. It just may not, you know, you may not see every provisional ballot that's been cured come in on election night. The final numbers that you're seeing are generally what we certify, which is, you know, generally about a week after the election.
So when it says at the bottom of your TV screen, these election results are not yet final, we're supposed to actually pay attention to that.
Right,
It matters.
Right.
So one of the other questions that we've got is, Ezra, you mentioned that the federal lawsuit is challenging the Tennessee law that prohibits first-time voters from voting absentee. One of our participants is wondering, is that that's specific to Tennessee, or is that something that you've seen in other places?
It's almost definitely just specific to Tennessee. There are two other states, I believe, Louisiana and Virginia, who have had a similar policy. I'm pretty sure that Virginia has changed it. I'm not certain about Louisiana, but there are very few states who do what Tennessee does. Under HAVA, you have an alternative under the Help America Vote Act. You have an alternative of having first-time voters vote by absentee ballot, but just copy a piece of identification. And Tennessee doesn't even do that.
Follow up to that, I know another claim that you all are challenging in federal court is the state law that makes it a misdemeanor to provide an unsolicited, for anybody but an election commission to give somebody an unsolicited application for an absentee ballot. So I think Tennessee did some research, and as far as we can tell, we're at least the only state in the South that has that, makes it a crime to send somebody an absentee ballot application. Ezra, what do you know about that? Is Tennessee an outlier there too?
I think it is. I don't know for certain, but I off the top of my head, I don't know of any other state that does that.
Thanks, Ezra. So another great question from one of our participants is, you know, if in the national news, there's a lot of folks, Attorney General Barr is one of them, who have been saying that absentee voting is subject to massive fraud. And it could, for instance, one example is that a foreign government could somehow submit tens of thousands of fake ballots, and election officials would be unable to tell whether those ballots were fake or not. Anybody on this call, could you address whether absentee ballots are in fact subject to more fraud?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I heard some of Attorney General Barr's comments. I mean, I think we're hearing this a lot from people who don't want people to vote. There's, you know, in our decision, Chancellor Lyle debunked a lot of the state's evidence, which wasn't near that far-fetched, and said that there's just not evidence of massive voter fraud with absentee ballot. I think it's important to remember. I mean, you know, Tricia gave you the numbers a second ago. Absentee balloting is not new. It's been going on for years. I think it dates back to maybe even the Civil War. You know, voting by mail is not a new concept. There are certain safeguards in place to make sure that people aren't abusing it. But, you know, in some of the charts that you were showing before, there's states that do this. Everybody can vote by mail, and a lot of people do, and it's been going on for years now. So if there were opportunities for bad actors to just exploit this and rig elections, I mean, you know, I don't know why that would start now, even though absentee voting has been around for decades. So I think a lot of this is hysteria drummed up to just try to scare people into not using this as a alternative, and to try to limit the way people are able to vote.
Yeah, Tom's absolutely right. As a matter of fact, in the state of Washington, I believe they've done studies. And the state of Washington has been completely vote by mail for a while. And they've done studies, and there's been virtually no incidents of fraud. And whenever they do find some aberrational examples of someone who should not have voted, it's typically someone whose father or mother had died, and they voted the father or mother's ballot kind of one last time, that sort of thing. There just is not that kind of voter fraud. To the extent the most recent example of any kind of fraud relating to absentee ballots was actually not voter fraud, but election fraud, meaning an election official. I think it was in North Carolina, committed voter fraud, election fraud with absentee ballots. But that is, again, aberrational, and there are extraordinarily strict criminal penalties against this. People just don't do it. You have a much better chance of being hit by lightning than you do of seeing any real voter fraud.
Right, and might I add that, you know, this notion of absentee voting is bipartisan. It has bipartisan support. We've looked at several polls that say, even national polls, over 67% of voters support voting by mail. And then even in Tennessee, almost 60% of voters want this. So we have to listen to the voters and not sort of fear tactics and scare tactics that, you know, scare people into what ifs. So we just have to remember, when we're trying to disenfranchise Democratic voters, they're also just disenfranchising their own supporters. So we should be trying to make sure everyone can vote.
Yeah, in fact, if I just pick up on what Charlane just said, really historically, absentee voting has not been the voting of choice by many voters in communities of color. And I think Charlane mentioned a certain amount of distrust. And there are also communities, Native American communities out west, where their mail service is so poor that absentee voting is not really a viable option for them. And one point that we should not lose when we talk about absentee voting and all this emphasis on voting by mail, we want to make sure that there are options, not just voting by mail, but options, including expanded early voting, that make sure that everyone can vote.
To follow up on that, the other kind of questions that sometimes aren't asked is, okay, we get these absentee ballots into everybody's hand, right? Which is great. Anybody who requests it, we get it into their hand. They print it out, they do the signature, they've, got the whole thing and send it back in. But what about folks who never received their absentee ballot, right? You never got it, or it showed up and you lost it. I have a big fear that lots of voters who requested absentee ballots then are going to say, okay, well, that's it. I did it. I can't go in and vote on election day now. I think it is important that we make sure that everybody knows that Tennessee's law did change. So now if you've requested an absentee ballot and you didn't get it, or you spilled coffee on it, or, whatever the issue was, you can still go to the polls during early vote or election day, and you can vote. Now, they're going to tell you you've got to vote provisionally, and that's what the law says, right? You'll have to fill out a provisional ballot, but like I just told you, we will in fact count all those provisional ballots. It just takes an extra couple of days. Strangely, also, Tennessee has a requirement that your absentee ballots must be received via the U.S. mail into the Election Commission's mailbox by close of polls on election day. So you can't just hand off. You can't just show up at the Election Commission and be like, here's my absentee ballot. It has to be done through the mail. So the last date that people can request an absentee ballot is 7 days before the election. So that has to give time for you to do your request, the Election Commission to get the request, the ballot to come to you, and then it to come back and be received by the post office by 7 o'clock at the close of election day. So to the extent we can push people to fill them out earlier, the greater chance people's ballots will be counted.
Tricia, I want to just make sure I understood that last point correctly, because I think that's critical for any grassroots organizations that are working on civic engagement this year. If there are Tennesseans who bring their absentee ballot to the polls, they cannot turn it in, and really they've sort of missed the boat, because at that point, even if they put it in a PO box, or if they drop it in a mailbox, there's no way it will arrive by the close of business on election day. That's right,
to arrive by the close of business on election day. Yes, that's right. So, if you're in that situation, the best thing to do is to have someone physically go to the polls and say they want to spoil their absentee ballot and they want to vote provisionally there. That's the best way. But, unfortunately, as Tennessee's law is complex in many arenas, having those quick sound bites on what to tell people, you kind of have to go through. It's almost a choose your own adventure book, right? If it's this, it's this. If it's this, it's this. There are just so many barriers, to make it easy. You should just be able to say, hey, show up and vote, or, you got this paper and you can drop it off and, whatever. But unfortunately, we've just made it so incredibly complex that I think it's difficult to message.
Yeah.
Speaking of complexity, sorry, Charlane.
Oh, I was just gonna, add that, groups like us, we're trying to do all that we can with the limited resources that we have to really try to compensate for all of those barriers by making it easy. A couple of things that we're doing is publishing our Tennessee voter guide. We're expanding it to Chattanooga and Memphis this year, in addition to Nashville. And we're dedicating at least 3 to 4 entire pages around voting during a pandemic and the absentee ballot process to explain that to folks. So encourage folks to download that and bring it with you to the polls and study it. The other thing is we're going to be putting together over 500 safe voter kits that is going to have a paper registration form, information about how to get an absentee ballot, and also postage, just in case you want to get that, send back your either paper registration form or the absentee ballot. So it's going to also include a mask, hand sanitizer in case you need to go to the polls. So we're just trying to do what we can for those that need that extra boost.
Charlane, you bring up a really good point too. This isn't just a Davidson County issue, right? This is something that's going to require a statewide effort. And so thanks to Tricia, we've got a decent insight, a really good insight into what Davidson County is doing in all the ways that they've been on top of it. So one question that we have here in the Q&A box is, is that true for all counties? Like Charlene, I know that with the Tennessee Black Voter Project, which Equity Alliance helped lead, can you speak to whether, what's going on in Davidson is the same as what's going on in Shelby, or, how different counties might compare?
Was that for me? Was that a question for me? Oh, yeah, every county, the challenge is every county is different. Every county runs their elections the way they want to run them. That's how our Secretary of State wants it, is all of these different arbitrary rules. So we do have to look at what is Shelby County doing versus Davidson versus Hamilton County, and give people those nuanced rules. And so it is a challenge to try to keep up with all of those. And so yeah, I'm not exactly sure how those are different, but I would encourage everyone to check out their state election commission website and give them a call.
Thanks, Charlene. Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes and so many questions, so I'm going to try to do a little bit of a speed round here, which is great. So awesome to have so much participation. This is clearly an issue that a lot of Tennesseans are thinking about. First question is about legal challenges to the wet signature requirement. Ezra or Tom, or do you all know of, whether at the state or the federal level, is anybody trying to challenge the fact that we can't use electronic signatures? Charlene mentioned that was a barrier to folks. That was a barrier to me. We were out of town when I applied for my absentee ballot. I had to go find a printer so I could print it out and use a wet signature rather than using an electronic one. Is anybody challenging that this year?
I'm not aware of any, and there have been a lot of suits brought around the country in absentee ballots. I might be wrong, but I can't pinpoint one that really focused on the wet signature, but it's an interesting issue. Tom, do you know of any?
I don't know of any either. I know there have been several about witnessing signatures, because that's a problem, obviously, with social distancing measures. But I haven't heard anything. I know that we're running into it a lot, just generally in the court system, of when you need a wet signature versus an electronic, and getting affidavits signed, getting declarations signed, and in order to file some of the lawsuits we filed. So, it's a problem that's very much, I think, on a lot of people's minds, just because of the pandemic. So certainly, I understand how that could be an obstacle in the context of vote by mail, but I'm not aware of any challenges to it right now.
Yeah, and you're right. The witness and notarization, we're challenging a dual notarization requirement in Mississippi, for example, and notarization and witness requirements have been challenged around the country.
All right, and a couple of questions, and we'll make this one our last, and then panelists, if you've got any closing words, we'd love to hear them. But real quick, in the vein of all these other states have nice things too, like why can't we have them too? One question about ballot tracking. So I know sometimes when you send in your absentee ballot, it might feel like you're sending it into a black hole. You don't really know if it's been received, if there was an issue with it, if it got counted, if it got rejected, what that looks like. So any idea about whether we're ever going to get something like that? And then we have a native Arizonan who wrote in and said, in my home state, there are drop boxes where you can just bring your absentee ballot and drop it off. Is that a nice thing that someday our state could have too, maybe using some of this federal money? So final question, what do you all think about any progress on either of those?
We have an opportunity to do some things the way we've never done them before because this is a pandemic. We're seeing how we have to shift out of archaic models and methods that our state has been using for decades. We have the money, we have HAVA funds, we have CARES Act money, and we should use this time to try to experiment on some new ways to do things, in addition to ballot tracking, to see how we can get more people to use absentee ballots, maybe even to get to a place where we're using more online methods and automatic voter registration and things of that nature that are proven to be solution-based and that improve voter participation. So I hope so, but we also need leaders who are bold, who are unapologetic, who aren't afraid to be innovative. And so we need to change that. If our elected and appointed officials aren't the ones to get it done, November 3rd is the opportunity to change the slate.
So in our final 90 seconds here, I think a question would be great to close out on is, we've got a lot of interested folks on this call, many of them lawyers. You know, what can people in Tennessee do in this current situation to help fix this sort of statewide problem during a pandemic? So any closing comments on that? And before I turn it over to you all to close, I'll just say thank you so much for being here. It's been an absolute privilege.
I'll just say, Shauna, you've done a great job, and thank you. And I would just say, Tennesseans, you have questions about voting, call our election protection hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE.
I think for my part, on the short term, I think just kind of spreading the word that there are opportunities now to vote absentee and getting that out there. In the long term, I just echo what Charlane just said and go vote. Tell everybody you know to go vote. You know, the next 2 elections during this pandemic are important, and they can help get some of these initiatives through.
And from an election commission standpoint, I mean, I do think we can always use more volunteers, more poll workers, more people that are working the machines that are making these decisions. And I know that that's something that people don't think about very often, especially as lawyers. We think about running election protection hotlines, which I love doing. I used to do it. I loved it, which is really great. But there's also this opportunity that, you need to have smart people who, in this case, aren't high risk. We've got, a significant issue with a lot of our poll workers being high risk. So, the more folks we can get engaged in the actual process and working the polls, I think, you're going to run into a lot less problems. Hopefully, we bring on a kind of a new generation that's going to be invested in working the polls and kind of keeping that aspect of democracy moving.
For the Equity Alliance, go to theequityalliance.org. We're always recruiting volunteers to either do voter registration. We're also recruiting for our election protection program. I know many attorneys are on this call. It would be great to be poll watchers and election protection hotline callers. So definitely do that. Make sure your family's registered to vote. Make sure your circle has everything they need to go out and vote safely. Encourage everyone to vote absentee and also vote early. We don't want to pack our polling locations on election day. I know a lot of people like to use that tradition, but we're not in traditional times. We need to vote early during the early voting period so that we can social distance appropriately.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. For our participants, a reminder to get CLE for this event. Please email your full name and your bar number to Callie Jennings over at Branstetter, Stranch, and Jennings. She is at Callie J, CALLIEJ at bsjfirm.com. And if you're not a member of the Nashville chapter of ACS and you want to be, you can find out more information about us at acslaw.org. So thanks again so much to all of you for joining us for this great event.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks.